The blood treaty was gone. Lucia Davenport stood perfectly still behind the marble service bar of the Velvet Meridian, a tray balanced in one hand and a crystal glass in the other, her dark eyes fixed on the exact spot where 30 seconds ago a man in a grey suit had slipped a rolled parchment from beneath the long banquet table and tucked it inside his jacket with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed the motion 1,000 times. She had seen every detail: the gloved hand, the deliberate brush of his sleeve against the silver document clasp, the almost imperceptible nod he exchanged with a woman near the east archway, who wore a red pin at her lapel shaped like a crescent moon. She had also seen something else. She had seen what the man in the grey suit truly was, because when he had leaned close to the table, the candlelight had caught the angle of his jaw at precisely the wrong moment, and his skin had been the colour of alabaster marble, utterly bloodless, and his eyes, when they flicked briefly across the room, had been the pale silver of a winter sky, 2 seconds before a storm swallowed it whole. Not human. Not even close. The room was full of them. She understood that now, in a way she had not fully understood when she had accepted this catering job 3 weeks ago through the agency. Believing it to be a private event for a wealthy European family, holding a dinner in the private subterranean ballroom of a hotel that, according to every online record she had ever found, did not technically exist at any address in the city. She had laughed off the oddness of it, because the pay was extraordinary, and her rent was 2 weeks late, and her mother's hospital bills were the kind of number that made her chest tighten every time she opened her banking application. Now she understood the subterranean location. Now she understood why the client files had listed dietary restrictions as simply blood work only, and why she and the other 3 human servers had been instructed to keep their eyes forward, never to pour unbidden, and under absolutely no circumstances to interrupt any conversation happening at the central table. The central table, where the blood treaty had just been stolen. She set the crystal glass down with a controlled steadiness that surprised even herself. Her heartbeat was loud in her own ears. She did not look at the man in the grey suit again because she understood instinctively that looking would mark her. She had grown up with an abusive stepfather who operated on the principle that a person who noticed too much became a liability, and that particular survival lesson had lived in her bones ever since she was 16 years old, quiet and watching and measuring the exact weight of silence. She was still measuring it now. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened with a sound like a held breath being released, and Marius Valemont walked in. She had not seen him before this moment, and yet the room changed the instant he entered it. The conversations at every table did not stop outright, but they altered in pitch and intention, the way the atmosphere alters in the seconds before a lightning strike, that charged, pressurized stillness that animals feel before humans do. He was tall, pale as new snow. His hair the color of white ash pulled back from a face that could have been carved from old stone by someone who understood that beauty and danger were not opposing forces. He wore a black coat, cut old world long, over a dark shirt, and his eyes were the deep, specific grey of ancient iron, the kind of grey that had weight and intention behind it. He moved directly to the central table. His gaze swept the document display stand where the blood treaty had been presented at the opening of this gathering, and in the space of a single breath, his entire bearing changed. He did not erupt. He did not shout. He became absolutely, crystallinely still in the way that the most dangerous things in the world are still. The way the ocean is still in the seconds before the water pulls back before a wave of catastrophic proportion. "Where?" he said, and the single word was quiet enough that Lucia, standing 20 feet away behind her service bar, felt it vibrate in the hollow of her throat. "Is the treaty?" The room erupted. She was already moving. Not toward the door, which would have required crossing the open floor. Not toward the other servers, who were clustering against the far wall, with the instinct of prey animals finding the herd. She moved behind the bar, deeper into the service corridor, pulling the rolling linen cart as cover, her mind clicking through what she had seen, with the cold, logical efficiency that had helped her earn a near-perfect grade in the criminal investigation course she had abandoned 2 years ago when money ran out, and she had taken the waitressing job instead. She had a witness's knowledge of who had taken the treaty. She had a direction, a face, a clothing description, a physical description of the woman with the crescent moon pin. She had the timestamp in her memory, 9:47 in the evening. What she did not have was any understanding of what happened to humans who witnessed things they were not supposed to witness in rooms that did not officially exist. The answer to that question arrived in the form of Marius Valemont stepping into the service corridor with absolute silent precision, and finding her standing there with her back against the wall, and her chin lifted, and her dark eyes meeting his without flinching, because Lucia Davenport had made a decision in the 3 seconds before he reached her, which was that she was not going to flinch. He stopped. He looked at her with those iron-grey eyes, and something moved through his expression that was not what she expected. She had expected cold fury, or the specific blankness of someone deciding whether a problem needed to be eliminated. What she saw instead was something that looked almost like assessment, genuine assessment, as if he were actually reading her. "You saw it," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said, because lying to someone who could likely smell a lie was not a strategy she was willing to employ. His jaw tightened. "You are human. Also, yes, you should not be here. We can debate the hiring practices of your event planning committee later," she said, and was immediately astonished at herself for saying it. But she had learned a long time ago that the one thing truly powerful people did not anticipate from someone they considered small was a steady voice. "But if you want to know who took your treaty, and what direction they went, and what the woman near the east archway looked like, you need to have a conversation with me rather than a threat." The silence between them was the kind that had specific texture to it, the texture of a decision being made. "Tell me," he said. So she did. She gave him every detail she had catalogued, cleanly in order, without embellishment or hesitation. The man in grey, the gloved hand, the practiced motion, the crescent moon pin on the woman by the arch. The direction they had both moved, which, based on the floor law layout she had memorized during her orientation walkthrough, led to the service stairwell at the building's northeast corner, which meant they had a vehicle waiting in the service alley, which meant they had planned every exit. He listened to her with the complete, absolute attention of someone who did not waste focus. When she finished, he was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Your name," he said. "Lucia Davenport." "Marius Valemont." He said it without ceremony, without the performance of title, though something in the weight of his tone suggested that title was present whether he announced it or not. "Can you walk without making noise?" "I've been doing it my whole career," she said. He moved. She followed. And that was how it began. The service stairwell smelled of old stone and cold air, and the sounds of the ballroom above faded with remarkable speed as they descended, rather than ascended, deeper into the building's infrastructure. Lucia registered this with a brief internal note and kept moving. Marius moved ahead of her with a predator's controlled silence, and she matched it, placing her feet with care, keeping her breathing measured. "They'll have Confederates," she said quietly. The woman with the pin wasn't a lookout. The angle she was standing, she was a signal relay, which means there's at least a third party. He glanced back at her over his shoulder. That same look, assessment. "You noticed all of that," he said. "I notice everything. It's a habit." "Why?" "Survival," she said simply, and left it at that. They reached a lower level that was not on any floor plan she had been shown. A long corridor of black stone lit by recessed lighting that had no business existing in what felt like medieval architecture. And she took exactly 1 second to feel the full strangeness of her situation before filing it under things to process later and continuing. 3 figures waited at the far end of the corridor. Marius stopped. Lucia stopped precisely half a step behind him and to the left, which put her out of direct line without putting her behind him entirely, because she was not going to stand behind anyone while she could not see what was happening. She heard him register the position she had chosen, heard it in the slight adjustment of his stance. The 3 figures were vampires. She could tell that now. The pallor, the particular stillness, the way they occupied space as if they had chosen each position with geometric deliberation. "Lord Valemont," the tallest of the 3 said. He had long dark hair and an angular face and the kind of smile that telegraphed its own danger. "You move quickly, Casimir," Marius said, and the single name was the coldest thing Lucia had heard him say, which was saying something. "The treaty is no longer your concern," the man called Casimir replied. The Covenant of 11 has voted to dissolve the blood treaty and begin negotiation on new terms. Under our terms, the Covenant of 11 has no authority to dissolve a document signed by 6 houses over 4 centuries ago, Marius said, and his voice was still that controlled, dangerous quiet. You know this, or you have always known this, which is why you chose theft over petition. We chose efficiency, Casimir said. As for your human, and his eyes slid to Lucia with the disinterested precision of someone noting a piece of furniture. That is a complication. She is under my protection, Marius said, and the shift in his tone was immediate and absolute. It was not a statement of sentiment. It was a declaration with the specific weight of old-world blood law behind it, and even Lucia, who had known this man for approximately 11 minutes, understood that he had just put something irreversible into the world. Casimir's expression flickered. He had not expected that. You extend your protection to a human witness. I extend my protection to whoever I choose, Marius said. Bring me the treaty, Casimir. Do not make this the moment you cannot walk back from. We're well past walking back, Casimir said, and the other two moved. What happened in the next 30 seconds was the most extraordinary thing Lucia Davenport had ever witnessed in her 27 years of life, which had not been short on extraordinary things. Marius Valemont moved with a speed that the human eye could track but only barely, and the violence was controlled and precise and absolute, the way surgical instruments are precise, and when it was finished, both of Casimir's companions were against the walls, and Casimir himself was pinned to the stone with one of Marius's hands at his collar, and the ancient, dangerous fury of someone who had been alive long enough to have run out of patience for certain kinds of behavior radiating from every line of his body. The treaty, Marius said. Casimir laughed, which took genuine nerve. You cannot hold me and retrieve it simultaneously. It has already been moved. Then you will tell me where, and if I decline? Then I will begin dismantling the Covenant of 11 piece by piece until it confesses to me, Marius said. I have done it before. I am prepared to do it again. The question is how much you value the current structure of your alliance. Casimir looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Lucia. The humans saw the theft. Yes, Marius confirmed. She's a liability to every house involved. She is under my protection, Marius repeated, and this time the repetition was not redundancy, it was emphasis. It was a wall being built in real time, stone by stone. Lucia watched this exchange and made several rapid calculations. The blood treaty, whatever it was, governed something between vampire houses. Casimir and his covenant had stolen it to force renegotiation. The theft had witnesses, primarily herself, and Marius had just publicly declared her under his protection, which, based on everything she was reading in the room dynamics, carried the force of law in whatever order governed these people. She stepped forward. Both men looked at her. She addressed Casimir directly. You need the witness neutralized, she said, but you can't touch me because he's declared protection over me, and doing so would violate whatever blood law governs that declaration, and give him grounds to move against you that he currently doesn't have. So you're in a worse position than when you started this conversation, which means your best play right now is to negotiate, not threaten. She paused. Where's the treaty? Casimir stared at her. Then he looked at Marius with an expression she could not quite read. Your human, he said slowly, is remarkable. I am aware, Marius said, and something in his voice had shifted by a degree that was small in measurement and vast in implication. The treaty had been taken to a location called the Meridian Vault, which was a secondary holding site owned by one of the Covenant's member houses, specifically House Waitress, whose elder, a woman named Isolde Waitress, had been the architect of the theft. Casimir gave this information with the careful precision of someone who had done the math and understood that his current position had no good exits, and that the most useful currency he had was information. Marius released him. You have 48 hours to remove yourself from this city, he said. Consider that generosity. Casimir straightened his collar, looked once more at Lucia with an expression that was complex and unreadable, and then walked away with his 2 recovered companions. And Lucia stood alone in the corridor with Marius Valemont, who turned to face her with the full weight of his attention, and she felt that weight the way you feel temperature change when you step from one room into another. You're shaking, he said. Adrenaline, she said. I'll manage it. You should not have spoken to him. It worked. It could have ended differently. Most things could, she said. Are you going to take me home, or are you going to continue explaining the risks of choices that already happened? Another of those silences. Then something moved across his face that she would think about later in the quiet of her apartment when she was trying to process the evening and failing. It was not quite a smile. It was the acknowledgement of something that had not been anticipated. I will take you home, he said. And then I will need to ask you to trust me with something that will complicate your life considerably. How much more complicated than tonight? She asked. Significantly, he said. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. Ask. He did not ask that night. He took her home in a car that was long and black and driven by a vampire whose name she was told was Aldrich, who had silver eyes and said nothing for the entire journey. Marius sat beside her in the back seat and said very little, but his presence was the kind that filled space completely without crowding it, and she found that she was acutely aware of every inch of distance between them on the leather seat, which was approximately 8 inches, which was both more and less than she wanted it to be, and she pushed that observation firmly into the category of things she was not currently processing. He walked her to the door of her building and stood in the amber glow of the street lamp and said, "Lock the door, all of them. Do not open for anyone but me. I will come tomorrow evening." You know which building I live in, she said. I knew before tonight, he said, and then, perhaps recognizing how that sounded, added, the agency that staffed tonight's event is registered with my house. I have access to employee files. I reviewed them before the gathering for security purposes. That's slightly alarming, she said. Yes, he agreed, without apology. Tomorrow evening. I work until 8, she said. At the diner on Carmichael Street, he said. I know. I will come at 9. She went inside. She locked every lock. She sat on her bed in her uniform and stared at the wall for 20 minutes before she picked up her phone and began writing down everything she had seen and heard, in order. Because she was the kind of person who documented things, who had always documented things, whose notebooks from childhood were filled with observations and questions and the careful architecture of a mind that refused to let experience pass through it unexamined. Then she made a cup of tea and went to bed and thought about iron grey eyes for longer than she would later admit to anyone. He came at 9. She was already home, already changed into dark jeans and a grey sweater, because she had spent the entire shift at the diner thinking about the Meridian Vault and the woman named Isolde Varenthis and the precise series of events she had witnessed. And she had come to several conclusions that she wanted to share. He knocked. She opened the door. He stood in her hallway looking exactly as he had the night before, composed and dangerous and luminously pale, and she stepped back to let him in and watched him take in her apartment with those iron eyes, and feel the particular strangeness of having someone like him in her ordinary kitchen with its ordinary mugs hanging on ordinary hooks. Tea? She offered. No, he said. Right, of course not. She sat at the kitchen table. He remained standing, which she noted but did not comment on. The Meridian Vault, is it in the city? No, he said. It is in the old quarter of a city approximately 400 miles from here, within the structure of a building that was constructed in 1712 and has been under House Verfenthis's ownership continuously since 1789, and the treaty is there now. Yes, and retrieving it requires going there. Yes, which is why you said my life was going to be complicated, she said. You want me to come with you? He sat then, taking the chair across from her, and the shift from standing to sitting felt like a deliberate choice, like the lowering of something. What I want, he said carefully, is for you to understand the full situation before I ask anything of you. The blood treaty is not simply a diplomatic document. It is a binding covenant between 6 vampire houses, written in the blood of each house's eldest, that governs the terms under which human and vampire civilization coexist without open conflict. It has kept this world from understanding what shares it for 400 years. If it is destroyed or rewritten under duress, the protections it guarantees collapse. What happens after that is not something I want to describe to you, but I think you can extrapolate. She could. She sat with that knowledge for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle. And the Covenant of 11 wants to rewrite it, she said. Wants to rewrite the terms of coexistence in ways that remove the protections currently guaranteed to humans, he said. Casimir's faction believes the current treaty is too restrictive, too protective. They are not the majority view within our world, but they are organized, and they are funded, and they have been building toward this moment for decades. And you are, she said. I am Lord of House Valemont, he said, one of the 6 founding houses. I hold a seat on the High Council, and I have spent the last 160 years ensuring that the treaty holds. She absorbed this. How old are you? A pause. 432 years. She nodded as if this were unremarkable, which it was not, but she found that her mind had already begun cataloguing the information rather than catastrophizing it, which was simply how she was built. The reason you want me, specifically, she said. It isn't just that I witnessed the theft. No, he said. The Meridian Vault requires a biological access key that Isolde Varenthis built into the lock mechanisms 30 years ago when she had it constructed, as a failsafe against vampire entry. It reads human biological signature. It was designed to ensure that even if her house fell to vampire enemies, the vault would be inaccessible to them. She didn't anticipate a vampire bringing a human along, Lucia said. She did not, he said. I have considered every other approach. I have considered sending human agents, but I do not have human agents I trust with this knowledge. I have considered force. But forcing the vault opens a mechanism that destroys its contents. I have considered Isolde herself, but she is the architect of the theft and will not cooperate. You are the only person outside of the Covenant who knows enough, who has seen enough, and who I have enough confidence in to ask this of. You've known me for 1 day, she said. I have, he said. And I am asking you to help me protect an agreement that keeps your entire species safe, with the full acknowledgement that I am asking you to put yourself in considerable danger, and that I would not ask it if I believed there were any other viable path. She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen was very quiet. What happened to not being able to touch me because I'm under your protection? She asked. The protection holds regardless of whether you come with me, he said. If you decline, I will find another way, and the protection remains. I am not making it conditional. Why? He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had a different quality, lower and more direct. Because you stood in that corridor last night, and spoke to Casimir with the kind of nerve that most people with 3 centuries more experience than you do not possess. And you did it to help me retrieve something you had no obligation to care about, and because you deserve protection simply for what you are, not for what you can provide. The silence after that was the kind that means something. I'll come with you, she said. But I have conditions. Name them. I am a full partner in this. You explain everything to me as we go. You don't make decisions that involve me without consulting me. And if something goes wrong, you tell me the truth rather than managing my response. Agreed, he said, without hesitation, and she believed him, which surprised her. But the thing she had learnt about certain people over the course of her life was that the dangerous ones were almost always more honest than the safe-seeming ones, because they had no need to dissemble. They were already the most powerful thing in the room. They left the following evening because day travel was not possible for him, something she had filed under the confirmed vampire law column without comment. The car was the same and long black one with Aldrich driving, and as they moved through the city toward the highway, Marius explained the structure of the High Council, the 6 founding houses, and the specific provisions of the blood treaty that the Covenant of 11 wanted to strike. She listened and asked precise questions and noted the answers, and somewhere around the 2nd hour of driving, she pulled her knees up to sit sideways in the seat so she could face him more directly, and he turned toward her with the naturalness of someone who had forgotten, briefly, to maintain the specific distance he had been maintaining, and they were closer than 8 inches now. Close enough that she could see the exact shade of his eyes in the passing highway lights, and she thought, not for the first time, and with considerably less resistance than the first time, that 432 years had arranged themselves into something that she found almost impossibly beautiful. You said the treaty keeps humans safe, she said. What does it give vampires? He considered the question. Order, he said. The legal framework of coexistence. Before the treaty, there was open feeding without sanction, which led to human populations discovering and hunting vampires, which led to wars that were catastrophic for both sides. The treaty established regulated feeding through willing participants, established legal identity for vampire houses within human governance structures through carefully maintained human intermediaries, and established the mechanisms by which we can live in this world without destroying it. "And you believe in that," she said. It was not a question. "I wrote half of it," he said. She turned to look at him fully. "You were there when it was written." "I was 26 years old, and by human reckoning," he said. "And I was already the lord of my house, because my maker had been killed in the wars I described. And I sat at that table and negotiated for 3 months with 5 other houses, who all had different priorities. And when we finished, I believed we had built something that would stand. And it did," she said. "For 400 years. "Yes," he said. "You're not going to let it fall now," she said. "No," he said, "I am not." The old quarter of the city they arrived in was the kind of place that existed in pockets of every European-influenced city, where the architecture had layers like geological strata, where the streets were narrow and the stone was old, and the lamplight did things to shadow that made the whole district feel like it was occupying slightly more than 3 dimensions. The building that housed the Meridian Vault was a narrow townhouse with a facade of dark brick and no signage and windows that looked inward rather than outward, and Lucia studied it from across the street with the same focused attention she had given to every detail since this had begun. "The access point is in the cellar," Marius said quietly. "There will be guards, not human. The vault door will require your hand against the reader, and it will confirm human biology before opening. Once inside, the treaty will be in a document case. We take it and leave." "And Isolde Varenthis?" Lucia asked. "Is in the city," he said. "Which means we have a window before she is alerted." "What's her position in vampire hierarchy?" Lucia asked. "Old and powerful," he said. "She is not someone I can move against directly without triggering a house war. But if I retrieve the treaty and present it to the High Council before she can make her claim, the theft is documented, her faction loses standing, and the Covenant of 11 loses the political cover it needs to proceed." "So speed matters more than confrontation," Lucia said. "Yes," she looked at the building. "There's a delivery entrance on the east side. I can see the access panel from here. If your people create a distraction at the front, I can go in through the service entry. The biological reader won't need to wonder what a human is doing, entering through a service door. It'll just confirm what I am and open the secondary route." He was quiet for a moment. "You mapped the approach in 30 seconds. 20, she said. "The other 10 I was rechecking. Do you have people who can create the distraction?" "Aldrich," he said, "and 2 others I called ahead. Then we have everything we need," she said. He touched her arm. It was the first time he had touched her since none of his actions in the corridor the first night could technically be called touching her, and it was just his hand at her arm, his fingers against the sleeve of her jacket. But the contact was deliberate, and his expression when he did it was something she had not seen from him yet, something that had nothing to do with strategy or ancient authority. "I need you to know," he said, "that if something goes wrong in there, you follow my voice. You do not stop, you do not argue. You trust that I will find you. You're protective," she said. "With the things that matter to me," he said. "Yes, without exception." She looked at the hand on her arm and then at him. "I'll follow your voice," she said. "It went wrong in the way that things go wrong when you have planned well but cannot account for variables. The distraction worked." The service entrance opened to her biology as predicted. The cellar access was clear. The vault door hummed and recognized her hand, and swung open with the precision of a mechanism built by someone who had thought through every angle. The document case was exactly where it had been described. Lucia lifted it. It weighed very little for something that had kept 2 civilizations from destroying each other for 4 centuries. The guard she had not accounted for was not at the vault, but in the stairwell between the cellar and the exit, and it was not a guard she had been warned about, because it was Isolde Varenthis herself, which meant the window had been smaller than calculated, and the lady of House Varenthis was not what Lucia had been imagining. She was slender and had the white hair that seemed common to older vampires, worn loose to her shoulders, and her eyes were the color of pale amber, and she looked at Lucia with an expression of entirely cold assessment. "The human who was there," Isolde said. "How inconvenient." Lucia held the document case at her side. She did not run. Running was the worst possible response, and she knew it in the same way she knew the weight of every room she had ever been in. "Lady Varenthis," she said, "because knowing names gave you footing. You built an impressive vault." Isolde tilted her head. "And you opened it." "I did. You understand what you're carrying?" "Yes," Lucia said, "which is why I'm going to walk out of this building with it." "You are a remarkable child," Isolde said, and began to move. Marius came through the wall, not literally, though in the half-second of Lucia's perception it felt like it. He had come through the door behind Isolde with a speed that resolved into presence only when he was already between them, and the authority he radiated in that moment was not the controlled, dangerous quiet she had learned to read. It was something older and larger, and considerably less contained. "Isolde," he said. The lady of House Varenthis stopped. Her amber eyes moved from Lucia to Marius and back. Something moved through her expression that was neither fear nor submission, but was its closer neighbor. "You extended your protection to a human," she said. "I did." "Blood law," she said. "Blood law," he confirmed. "Touch her and you invoke a war between our houses that you cannot win. I have held this office for 4 centuries and I have not lost a house war yet. You know this." The stairwell was very small. The document case was in Lucia's hand. The treaty was inside it. Lucia breathed steadily and watched Isolde Varenthis make the calculation that Casimir had made in a different corridor 2 days ago, and arrive at the same destination. "The covenant will not stop," Isolde said. "The covenant will be presented to the High Council tomorrow morning with a full account of this theft," Marius said. "Whatever political future you imagined for yourself, make your decisions accordingly." "The human," Isolde said. "She knows everything." "She does," Marius said, "and she is under my protection. We are finished discussing her." Isolde looked at Lucia for a long moment, with those amber eyes that held 400 years of calculation in them, and Lucia met the gaze and did not look away, because she had never looked away from anything in her life, and she was not starting now. "You chose well," Isolde said to Marius, and then she stepped aside. They walked out, on the street, in the cold night air. Lucia held the document case against her chest, and found that she was breathing harder than she had acknowledged during the encounter, and Marius was at her side so immediately that she was not sure whether he had moved or had simply always been there. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. His hand was at her back. Not guiding, not steering, just there, present, the warm weight of it. "You were extraordinary," he said, and the word had none of the detached assessment quality it had carried in earlier conversations. It was something else entirely. She turned to look at him. They were close again. The close distance that kept finding them, and the lamplight was on his face, and he was looking at her with those iron-grey eyes, in a way that she had been noticing for 2 days and refusing to name. "You came through the door before she touched me," she said. "I was always going to come through the door before she touched you," he said. "How did you know?" "I have been aware of every room you have been in and every inch between you and anything that could threaten you since the moment I put you under my protection," he said. "The distance between us in that stairwell was 11 feet. I have moved through wider gaps than that." She searched his face. "Is that the protection speaking or something else?" A silence. A very specific silence. The kind he employed when the honest answer required him to lower something he had been holding at a particular height. "Something else," he said. "Marius," she said. "Lucia," he said, and her name in his voice. In that voice that had 4 centuries of weight behind it was a complete sentence. She kissed him. Or he kissed her. Later, she would not be able to truthfully establish which of them had moved first, because it had felt entirely simultaneous, like 2 things that had been separate discovering they had always been the same. His hands were at her face, careful and certain, and she had the document case in one hand and her free hand at his coat, and he kissed her with the contained intensity of someone who had been holding something very carefully and had finally put it down. When they separated, neither of them spoke for a moment. He pressed his forehead briefly to hers, a gesture that was so quiet and unperformed that it struck her as the most intimate thing she had seen from him. "The High Council," she said eventually. "Yes," he said. "Let's go," she said. The High Council met before dawn in the chamber beneath the city that she was driven to with the document case in her hands, and Marius beside her and Aldrich, driving in silence. The chamber was everything she had been building toward understanding. A vast underground space carved from old stone, lit by what appeared to be both modern recessed lighting and very old wall fixtures that predated electricity, populated by 5 figures besides Marius, each representing one of the other founding houses, each white-haired and ancient-eyed, and carrying the specific gravity of beings who had been making important decisions for a very long time. She stood before them and gave her account. Everything she had seen in the Velvet Meridian, the man in grey, the practiced motion, the crescent moonpin, the east archway, the 9:47 timestamp, she gave it with the same ordered, unembellished clarity she had given Marius in the service corridor on the first night, and the High Council listened the way the most dangerous and intelligent people always listen, with absolute stillness. When she finished, one of the 5, a woman with silver-white hair and dark eyes, who was introduced as Lady Haldress Vaughan, looked at her for a long moment. "You have the recall of a trained investigator," she said. "I was studying for it," Lucia said, before the funding ran out." Lady Haldress looked at Marius. Something passed between them that Lucia could not fully translate, though she caught its general meaning. "The treaty is intact?" Another council member, Lord Severin, asked. "It is," Marius said. "I will propose it be moved to the Grand Chamber vault under 3-house key access, and that the Covenant of 11 be presented with a formal sanction for treaty interference." The deliberations took 2 hours. Lucia sat in a side chamber with a cup of tea that Aldrich brought her without being asked, which struck her as unexpectedly touching, and she organized her thoughts and wrote in her notebook, and thought about everything that had happened in 4 days, which was more than had happened in the previous 4 years, or felt that way. Marius came to find her when the council concluded. He sat across from her and told her that the treaty had been returned to secure keeping, that the Covenant of 11 had been issued a formal sanction that stripped 3 of its member houses of standing on the lower council, and that Casimir had already left the city as instructed. "And Isolde?" Lucia asked. "House Varenthis will face a formal hearing within the month," he said. "Isolde is old and careful and will navigate it, but her political leverage is finished." The council was unanimous. "So it's done," she said. "The immediate crisis, yes," he said. "The underlying tensions in our world that produce the Covenant of 11 are not something that resolve in 4 days. But the treaty stands. The framework holds." He paused. "Because of you. Because we worked together," she said. He looked at her across the small side chamber, and there was nothing of the political authority or the contained danger in his expression now. There was something quieter and more fundamental, something that had been building through 4 extraordinary days, and a kiss on a lamplight street in a city that existed in layers. "Lucia," he said, "there are things I need to say to you that have nothing to do with the treaty or the council or the protection I declared." "I know," she said. "You know everything before I say it," he said, and there was something almost wondering in his voice. The wonder of a person who has been alone in the specific way that extraordinary people are alone, surrounded by deference and authority, and no one who simply sees them, and who has suddenly found someone who does. "I don't know everything," she said. "I know what I can observe. There's a lot I haven't observed yet." "There is," he agreed. "Centuries of it. That's a considerable amount of material," she said. "It is." She met his eyes. "I have a second job interview next week," she said, "for an investigative firm that does background work for private clients. I've been rebuilding toward the career I had to leave. I'm not going to stop doing that." "I would not want you to," he said immediately. "Your mind is one of the most remarkable things about you. Watching you work is," he paused, and for the first time she saw him search for a word, this man who had 400 years of language available to him. "It is the most compelling thing I have encountered in a very long time." "That's a high bar," she said. "You clear it," he said. She felt the warmth of that move through her in a way that she had stopped trying to dismiss. "I'm not going to be manageable," she said. "I'm not going to stay behind and not argue when I have better information than you." "I noticed," he said, "the service corridor, the street plan, the stairwell with Isolde. You were right every time." "Almost every time," she said. I didn't account for Isolde being in the building. Neither did I, he said. Which is why we work better together than either of us works alone. The honesty of it. The directness of a man who had the kind of pride that comes with 4 centuries of authority, admitting that someone else completed what he was, reached her in the quiet of that chamber under the old city, and she thought about her mother's hospital bills, which were real, and her rent, which was real, and her life above ground, with its ordinary mugs and its tea, and its careful survival, and she thought about iron-grey eyes, and a hand at her back, and a forehead pressed gently to hers on a lamplight street. What does it look like, she asked. Whatever this is, between us, what does it look like practically? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. My world is hidden within yours, he said. I move in both. I have properties above ground and below. I maintain human professional identities through intermediaries. I am embedded in the world you live in because it is the world I help govern. A life with me would not require you to disappear from your own. But it would require me to know everything, she said. You already know almost everything, he said, and you have handled it with more grace than people who spent years being prepared for it. Because I was already watching, she said. Because you were already watching, he agreed. She stood. He stood. The chamber was quiet, and the city above them was in the hours before dawn, that specific hush, and she walked the 2 steps between where they had been sitting, and he was absolutely still, the way he was still when something mattered. She put her hand against his chest. She felt his hands come to her waist, careful and certain in equal measure. I don't love things halfway, she said. I never have. If this is something, it is going to be something real. I understand the terms, he said. Do you, Lucia, he said, and again her name in his voice was a complete sentence. I have lived 400 years, and I have not once in those years stood in a service corridor, and felt what I felt when you looked at Casimir without flinching and told him his own tactical position. I have not once wanted to put myself between something and a person with the specific urgency I felt in that stairwell with Isolde. I have declared blood law protection over you, not because the political situation required it, but because the thought of anything reaching you was intolerable to me, and it happened before I had named why. He looked at her with those eyes. I am not a person who does things halfway either. She kissed him again. In the quiet chamber under the old city, with the treaty secured in its vault above them, and the long, dangerous, extraordinary days of the past 4 settled around them like the stone walls settled around the light. She kissed him, and he held her with the certainty of someone who had lived long enough to know the difference between something that passes and something that stays. The weeks that followed were not without complication, because the world, including the hidden one, rarely resolves all at once. The Covenant of Eleven's formal hearing before the High Council produced 3 weeks of political tension that Marius navigated with the long-practiced precision of someone who had done this kind of thing many times, and Lucia sat beside him at 2 of those sessions in an official capacity, because Lady Caldress Vaughan had asked Marius with elegant indirection whether his human witness would be willing to make a formal deposition, and Marius had looked at Lucia and said, in a tone that very carefully made it her choice, and not his preference, that she would answer for herself. She had answered yes. She gave the deposition with the same precision she had given everything else, and afterward Lady Caldress told her, in private, that the council had been discussing the lack of a formalized human liaison position for 2 decades, and that Lucia's background in investigative work, combined with her demonstrated capacity to operate effectively within the council's world, made her a uniquely qualified candidate if she was interested. Lucia had taken 48 hours to think about it, had written 3 pages of questions, and had returned to Lady Caldress with all 3 pages. Lady Caldress had read every page with visible appreciation and said, Lord Valemont chose well. He didn't choose me, Lucia said. I chose this. Lady Caldress had smiled, which on a face carrying 400 years was a complex and layered expression. Then the council chose well to accept you, she said. She took the investigative firm job as well, because Marius had been entirely truthful about her mind being her own and her career being her own. The firm dealt primarily in private background and asset investigation, and her new access to council records and Vampire House documentation through her liaison role meant that she could see patterns in financial and legal records that human investigators consistently missed, and within 3 months she had become the person the firm's senior partners sent complicated cases to, without fully understanding why. She was so much better at them. She did not tell her mother everything. She told her mother that she had taken a contract position with a private legal and diplomatic firm, which was accurate, and that the pay was considerably better, which was also accurate, and that she had met someone, which caused her mother to ask 11 questions in rapid succession from her hospital bed, while recovering from a procedure that was, for the first time in 2 years, fully covered. "What is he like?" her mother asked. Lucia thought about this. "He is old-fashioned in some ways," she said carefully, very certain of himself, very protective. "He takes things seriously, and he doesn't say things he doesn't mean." "And is he good to you?" her mother asked. "Yes," Lucia said. "Completely." "Then he's good," her mother said, and patted her hand, and that was that Marius met her mother 6 weeks later, which was not a thing Lucia had planned in advance, but which happened naturally when her mother was discharged from the hospital, and Lucia brought her home, and Marius arrived at the apartment at 9 in the evening with what appeared to be an extraordinarily expensive arrangement, wifed out flowers, and the specific careful courtesy of someone who had spent centuries understanding that meeting the family of someone who matters is its own kind of high-stakes negotiation. He called her mother Mrs. Davenport and asked about her health and listened to the answers with complete attention, and her mother, who had an excellent instinct for people developed through considerable painful experience, looked at him for a long moment and then looked at Lucia and said quietly, "He looks at you like you're the most important thing in the room." "He does," Lucia said. "Good," her mother said again, with finality, the night her mother went to bed. Lucia and Marius sat on the small balcony of her apartment, with the city spread below them, and she told him about her stepfather for the first time. Told him with the level, clear voice of someone who had processed a thing, but still felt the weight of it, and he listened without interrupting and without reacting with anything that condescended to her strength by performing excessive sympathy. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You learned to read danger in rooms because you had to, and then you kept the skill long after you escaped the original danger." "Yes," she said. "And when you walked into a room full of things considerably more dangerous than a violent man," he said, "you read it the same way, accurately." "Yes," she said. "You are one of the strongest people I have known," he said. "In 4 centuries of knowing people. I want you to understand that. I mean that with full comprehension of the comparison." She looked at him in the city light. "You're not going to make me feel like a liability for being human," she said. "Never," he said. "Your humanity is not a weakness you overcome. It is what makes your mind and your courage what they are. I would not trade it." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The city hummed below them in its ordinary nighttime way, full of ordinary people living ordinary lives that were kept ordinary, in part, by a treaty that had nearly been lost and had been found again because a waitress had been watching and had not flinched. The formal Covenant of 11 hearing concluded with 2 members of the Covenant losing their house seats entirely, a consequence that was apparently the political equivalent of a considerable catastrophe in vampire governance. And Casimir, who had managed to negotiate a reduced sanction by cooperating with the council's inquiry, was stripped of his voting rights for 20 years and placed under a supervision covenant that Marius described to Lucia as essentially the vampire equivalent of probation. Isolde Varenthis retained her house standing, but lost her council appointments and was required to make a formal public acknowledgement of treaty violation before the assembled houses, which Marius told Lucia with a quiet satisfaction was the kind of lasting political wound that someone like Isolde would feel for a generation. "Is it enough?" Lucia asked, "to discourage the next attempt?" "No attempt is ever fully deterred," he said. "But the cost calculus changes significantly. The Covenant's plan failed, their leadership was dismantled, and the process that failed them was a human witness with perfect recall working in direct partnership with House Valemont. That combination is now part of the council record and part of the institutional memory. The next faction that considers treaty interference will have to account for the possibility of the same as he. So I'm a deterrent, she said. You are considerably more than that, he said. She turned to look at him. They were in his study, which was in the house she had visited for the first time 3 weeks ago, a tall townhouse 3 blocks from where she lived, decorated in the way of someone who had 4 centuries of accumulated taste and the resources to indulge it, full of dark wood and old books and paintings that she had spent considerable time examining with the focused delight of someone who had been told she had access to a remarkable archive and immediately begun cataloguing it. I want to keep working on the treaty framework, she said. The covenant wasn't wrong that there are provisions that need updating. They were wrong about which provisions and wrong about the method. But the underlying argument that a document written 4 centuries ago needs review to account for the ways the world has changed, that argument isn't invalid. Marius looked at her with an expression she had learned to read over the months of knowing him, the expression that meant he was genuinely surprised and had been presented with a perspective he had not considered, and that it had shifted something. You want to propose a voluntary review process, he said. I want to propose a structured diplomatic process for amendments that maintains the treaty's core protections and the consent of all 6 houses, she said, which is different from what the covenant was trying to do, and which would actually address the legitimate grievances that make factions like the covenant viable in the first place. He was quiet for a long moment. That would require significant political architecture, he said. Yes, she said, which is why you'd need someone who knows how to build it. You studied diplomacy as well as investigation, he asked. I studied everything I could access, she said. When you grow up without resources, your mind becomes the thing you invest in, because it's the one asset no one can repossess. He stood up from behind the desk and came to where she was sitting on the reading chair with her notes on her lap, and he crouched down to be at her level, which was a gesture she had noticed he made when he wanted to see certain they were speaking to each other and not one above the other, which she found unexpectedly moving every time. Present the proposal to the council, he said. I will support it formally and publicly. You haven't heard the proposal yet, she said. I have heard enough of your thinking over the past 4 months to know that when you present something formally, it will be built to hold, he said. I am prepared to support it. She looked at him. That's a significant amount of trust. Yes, he said simply. She put her hand against his face. He turned into it slightly, the smallest movement, the gesture of something that had stopped performing its own composure. She had come to understand that about him over the months, that the composure was not a mask, but was genuinely him, and that the small, unguarded moments were not its absence, but were what existed alongside it, beneath it, in the spaces where 4 centuries of dignity stepped back and let something older and more fundamental through. Marius, she said. Yes, he said. I love you, she said. Because she did, and because she had been building towards saying it for several weeks with the careful architecture of someone who does not say things they do not mean, and because she had arrived at certainty in the methodical way she arrived at all certainties, through evidence and observation, and the tested weight of a thing against reality, and the evidence was overwhelming, and the weight of it had proven itself in fire and stone corridors, and lamplight, streets, and treaty vault, and every conversation in between. His expression did something then that she would carry with her for a very long time. It was the expression of a person who has held themselves with dignity through everything that has ever come at them, who has made themselves sufficient and capable and unassailable over centuries of necessity, discovering that another person sees all of it and chooses to love it anyway, not despite the danger and the age and the power and the grief of 400 years, but alongside all of it, including all of it, choosing the whole thing. Lucia, he said, and his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. I know, she said. I have loved you, he said, since the corridor, since you looked at Casimir and told him his own position, since you stood in front of Isolde and did not move. I have loved you every moment since, and I will love you for every moment I am given, which I intend to be a very considerable number. She kissed him, and he held her in the study full of old books and centuries of accumulated life, and outside the city moved in its ordinary way, and beneath it, in chambers carved from old stone, the blood treaty held in its vault, intact and protected. the framework of a coexistence that two civilizations had been building carefully for 400 years, and that would go on building, amended and strengthened and honest in its review, because the person who had proposed that honesty was now part of it, woven into its institutional record, a human woman with a waitress's uniform and a witness's memory and a mind that had never once stopped watching. The amendment process took 8 months to design, and Lucia presented it to the High Council on a Wednesday evening in March in the chamber beneath the city. Standing at the presentation table with her notes and her 3-page initial outline expanded to a full 32-page structural proposal, with Marius seated among the council members watching her with the particular quality of attention she had come to understand was his love language, the absolute complete investment of someone who found everything she did interesting. She presented for 2 hours. The council asked 47 questions. She answered all 47. Lady Caldris asked a 48th that was the kind of question designed to probe for holes in a proposal's foundation, and Lucia answered it with a precision that made two of the council members exchange a look she had learned to read as impressed. The council approved the amendment framework 7-0. Lord Severin noted for the record that it was the first unanimous council vote on a structural matter in 90 years, on the street outside, in the April cold night air, with the city humming around them. Marius stood in front of her and looked at her with 4 centuries of ancient, proud, dangerous, honourable self looking at the person it had chosen completely. "Well done," he said. "We did it," she said. "Not just me. We," he agreed. "I want to go home," she said. "I want tea and your absurd collection of 19th century political philosophy, and I want to not think about treaty law for approximately 12 hours. "Achievable," he said. "And I want you there," she said. "Always," he said. She took his hand. He held it with the certainty of a person who had made a choice and made it completely, without reservation or ambivalence, or the elaborate self-protection of someone who is still waiting to be convinced. They walked through the April night, human and vampire, ordinary street and ancient hidden world, past ordinary people who did not know what moved alongside them, did not know that a document in a vault beneath them had kept their world safe for 4 centuries and would continue to keep it, amended and honest, and held by more hands now than it had ever been, because a waitress had watched, and had not looked away, and had not flinched, and had walked forward into the most extraordinary thing she had ever encountered with her chin up and her eyes open and everything she was fully committed. The city breathed around them. The treaty held, and Lucia Davenport walked through the April night with her hand in Marius Valemont's hand. Going home, she did not know, as they walked, that Lady Caldris had already begun drafting the formal proposal to make the liaison position permanent, or that the documentation would name her specifically, or that the title on the document would carry a secondary notation. Principal Human Architect of the amended Blood Treaty Framework. She would learn that in 3 days, when Marius brought her the letter with the expression of someone who is deeply pleased and is allowing himself to show it, and she would read it twice and then put it down and look at him. "You knew," she said. "Caldris told me this morning," he said. "I did not tell you before the vote because I did not want it to influence your presentation." "It wouldn't have," she said. "I know," he said. "But I wanted nothing between you and your work." She looked at the letter again, at her name on it, at the word architect. She had grown up without resources, without the career she had tried to build, without the safety net that most people either had or could borrow against. She had built everything she had through observation and memory and the determined application of a mind that had been told in 1,000 small ways that it did not belong in the rooms it was looking into. She was now in the record of a 400-year-old governing body as the architect of its most significant structural reform. She put the letter down and went to where Marius was standing and put her arms around him, not because she needed to be held up. She had never needed that, but because she wanted to share the particular weight of a moment with the person who had seen her most clearly, who had placed her under his protection not because she was helpless, but because she was extraordinary, who had agreed with complete conviction that she should not stop being herself, should not shrink, should not stand behind, and had stood beside her instead every time. He held her with the steady certainty of something that was not going to let go. "What do you want?" he said quietly. After this, in the long run. What does Lucia Davenport want her life to look like? She thought about it. She was 27 years old, and she was the principal human architect of the amended Blood Treaty framework, and she was in love with a man who was 432, and she was standing in a study full of old books in a house 3 blocks from her apartment in a city built on layers of ordinary and extraordinary. I want this, she said, the work, the cases, the counsel. I want to keep building the thing that keeps both worlds safe. I want my mother healthy and my career real and my rent paid, which is now possible. She pulled back to look at him. And I want you. For as long as you'll have me, which you said, was a considerable number of moments. Infinite, he said, correcting himself with a precision that made her almost laugh. I said considerable, I meant infinite. That's a long time, she said. Yes, he said. I am aware. I am also aware that human lifespans do not match immortal ones, and that there are questions embedded in what you are saying that we will need to discuss with honesty. She nodded. She had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully and at considerable length the way she thought about everything. Is there a mechanism for it? She asked. In your world, is it possible? There are old covenants, he said. Old blood rights. They are not taken lightly and they carry weight that cannot be reversed. The decision would be yours, and it would need to be made with full knowledge of what it means, and I would not rush it or press it or allow it to be made from anything less than complete willingness. How long does complete willingness take to establish? She asked. There is no required timeline, he said. You could take years. And you would wait, she said. I have been waiting for 400 years to find someone I would consider it for, he said. Whatever time you need is not an imposition. She looked at him for a long moment. Ask me again in a year, she said. Give me a year of this being what it is, and then ask me again. A year, he said, accepting it completely, without pressure or performance of patience. It was simply what she needed, and therefore it was what they would do. She kissed him. In the study, in the house, in the city, built, on layers and outside the April night, was finishing itself into an early morning, and somewhere in the chamber beneath the city, the blood treaty sat in its new vault with 3-house key access, and in 8 months it would be formally amended, and the amendment would carry her name. And all of it was real and built on real things. On the decision she had made to look without flinching, to speak when she had information, to walk forward into extraordinary danger with her mind clear and her courage intact. On the day the amended blood treaty was formally ratified by all 6 founding houses and presented to the full council, Lucia wore a dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, dark blue and precise, and Marius stood at her side in the chamber as the ratification was recorded. And when Lady Caldress read the names of the architects and the framework designers, and the negotiators whose work had produced the revision, Lucia's name was listed alongside names that had been in council records for centuries. She stood straight and still and felt the particular quiet of a moment that has completed itself entirely. After standing in the corridor outside the chamber, Marius took her hand and pressed it to his mouth briefly, not a grand gesture but a specific one, intimate and deliberate. 143 days, he said. She looked at him. What? Since the velvet meridian, he said. Since the night in the service corridor, she counted backward. He was right. You've been keeping track, she said. Every day, he said, every single one. She thought about the woman she had been on that evening, in her server's uniform, with a tray in her hand, and a rent payment overdue, and a mother in a hospital, and a career she had abandoned, watching a man in a grey suit with a gloved hand take something from beneath a long table. She thought about the decision she had made without fully making it, to keep watching, to remember, to speak when spoken to, and to not flinch. She thought about the service corridor, and the iron grey eyes, and the question that had asked her what she had seen and the answer she had given. She thought about the lamplight street, and the kiss and the forehead pressed briefly to hers in the quiet way of something that had nothing left to perform. 143 days. A blood treaty stolen and recovered, and transformed into something better than it had been. A hidden world brought into contact with the best of what she was. A love built on trust and danger, and the absolute refusal of both of them to be anything other than entirely real with each other. Ask me, she said. He went, still, It's been 143 days, he said. You said a year. I know what I said, she said. Ask me. He looked at her for a long moment. 432 years looked at 27 years and found in them something it had not found in all the centuries before, which was the specific, irreplaceable thing that happens when the right person stands in the right corridor at the right moment and refuses to look away. Lucia Davenport, he said. Will you stay? Yes, she said. Completely. He held her face in his hands the way he had on the lamplight street, and kissed her in the corridor outside the chamber where the amended blood treaty was now part of the permanent record, and the world above them went on in its ordinary way. Ordinary people in ordinary lives, safe and unknowing, held in a framework that had almost fallen, and had been made stronger by two people who had found each other in the moment of its greatest danger. The blood treaty held. The love was real, and Lucia Davenport chose to stay.